Hey everybody, Professor Snark checking in as we move out of our unit on sort of focused on Mary Wollstonecraft as far as the reading goes, but then a little bit more broadly in terms of British women romantic authors. And we took the time period fairly flexibly. So some people investigated some authors who were writing well into the 19th century, others a little bit earlier, but saw some interesting parallels in terms of the lives that people, female authors, were living oftentimes, but then also some interesting differences, which is good because while we want to investigate and recover some of those voices from the time period, we don't want to come away thinking that there was sort of this one female voice speaking in unison about every topic sort of every female author agreed on, sort of a thing. So there's complexity within that kind of unified group of people. So we move on now to unit number 5, I believe it is, William Blake, one of the major Romantic era figures and one of my personal favorites and also the focus for my PhD work and the subject of my first book. So someone that I've been really involved with in terms of research, in terms of teaching, and I often think about whether I feel like Blake is kind of more complex than other authors we study, which is an unfair thing to say, but whether I feel that because I've been just, immersed in his work for so long, or if in fact that complexity or certain elements of that complexity, or maybe the reasons that it's complex, is exactly what drew me to Blake in the first place. So that maybe it's a chicken or egg kind of argument, but either way, I have a predilection for Blake and his work. And as I point out in the unit here, and as you'll see immediately, one of the most fascinating things about Blake is that he was both an artist and a poet. So his own work always or almost always features both what we call a visual, so the illustration part, but also a verbal element, the text on the page. And this is where our textbook, and all textbooks really, and they fall so short in terms of representing an artist to us, which is actually one of the ideas that I just want to talk about here. And it's one of those overarching ideas that we don't really address specifically in one of the units, but applies to every unit. And this is the notion of how our encounter with an author's work is always mediated by a textbook or a book of some kind, or sometimes we read on the computer or a mobile device of some kind. In other words, there's always something that provides us access to that particular work. And this doesn't mean just in the case of Blake, where we have maybe access through the computer to his more of the visual dimension of his work. It applies for every artist and every writer that we encounter. We're always given access to that person through, in most cases, our textbook, but whatever medium we happen to be using. And we often forget about the influence that that medium, the sort of the material thing that allows us access to that work, we forget about the influence that that has on how we understand that author. And it can be something as simple as, obviously in our textbook, a section on Mary Wollstonecraft, for example. We get an editor's introduction, so that already kind of conditions us to see certain things, but not other things in her work. We get an excerpt from her whole body of work, so we don't get everything she wrote. We get sometimes an excerpt from particular work, so we don't get the full thing. So our encounter with Wollstonecraft is always conditioned by these sort of outside forces that are inevitable. It's almost always going to be the case that there's some gap in our knowledge, or something missing in terms of what's represented. And so that in and of itself is interesting to think about. But then the real complication comes when we think about how, if your access to Wollstonecraft or to Blake or to anybody is, let's say, through our textbook, which is, I think, the best textbook we have access to. So it's not like this is a problem with our particular book. Ours does actually one of the best jobs of representing authors to us. But let's say your encounter with Blake occurs through the textbook. my encounter occurs through the Blake Archive, which is online. Somebody else encounters Blake in a collection of like an introduction to poetry type of anthology or a textbook. So there's just one or two of his works, and they're usually, if you've encountered Blake this way, you're going to run into maybe The Tiger, maybe a couple of other poems from his Innocence and Experience collection, which was produced fairly early in his work. And of course, you're going to get probably just the text of those works, not the illustration part, not the visual part. But then we would have a discussion amongst all of those scholars, or all of those students, about Blake, or about T.S. Eliot, or about anybody. It's not specific to a person or to a time period. As if each of those people sort of had equal or similar access to the same poet, William Blake. So it's really fascinating then to think about how our understanding of a particular artist or poet is so conditioned by all of these things, but then we'd have a discussion about, oh, I think Blake is this, or I think Blake is that, or Blake seems to write about this, as if we'd all read exactly the same textbook and all had exactly the same access to all of Blake's work. And I'm not suggesting that we should always read everything we possibly can and see every possible picture of every author we encounter. I mean, that's obviously not feasible. But what I'm asking is that we keep in mind all of those kind of material details about how we encounter authors, and then how that material encounter really shapes our understanding, especially for you guys in a survey course like this, where we just spend so little time on a small piece of work from an author who we take as representative of an age. So there's obviously just so much that we don't cover. You come out completing the course, and it's sort of my job to do the best I can to fill in the gaps, or to choose authors who are representative, or works by those authors that are representative, so that you do come out with a fairly complete picture. But of course, even a complete picture in these terms is, 95% incomplete. It's always going to be that way. And again, I'm not suggesting this is a problem we need to solve. It's just a condition of the way we encounter texts and artists that is unavoidable, so we have to be aware of it. And it's something that's particularly interesting to me, that kind of, like, how does a book work, the physical structure of a book, the way a page is laid out, the kind of logic of a book, that we have to go 1, 2, 3 in terms of the pages. How does all of that kind of culturally influence the way that we read for meaning, which we usually think of as kind of abstract or intangible? The book is the physical thing, but the meaning is sort of like the ideas in there. And we like to separate those out so that, yeah, there's the book, and then there's the meaning, but it just doesn't make sense that we could all have a different book, or one person has the book, one person has a web, another person has a different book. And yet we all try to get the same meaning out of it, as if those two things are separable somehow. But fundamentally, they're just not. And this brings me back to why Blake as an artist is so intriguing, and has been for me for so many years, is that his work, and this is part of what I highlight in the unit, is so kind of insistently aware of the material nature of producing art, communicating it to a readership or a viewership, and all of that stuff. So it's like, for Blake, there was no separating the medium from the message, to use a more contemporary formulation, or the material thing, whether it's the copper plate that he's engraving, or the book that he's producing, the professional engraving that he's doing for someone else's work, and then that kind of abstract meaning side of things. There was just no separation between those two for someone like Blake, who's often misread as this very kind of mythical and abstract and really out there, kooky kind of guy. If you read just for meaning, he does appear that way. In fact, he's kind of impenetrable. But once you begin to ground some of that more abstract stuff in the material kind of reality of how he produced his art, it's a lot more accessible, and you find a lot of patterns emerge in his work that are all sort of circling around this main condition of how we have to encounter ideas. It's always through some medium. It's always, it's not immediate. There's always some mediation going on, which is again something that I highlight in a couple of the works that we're reading from the Songs of Innocence and of Experience collection. The introduction to that collection and The Tiger, maybe one of Blake's most famous and most misunderstood works. But anyway, I'll let you get to that in the unit itself. So as always, if you have any questions, be in touch with me, and I hope you enjoy this unit because it allows us to really kind of immerse ourselves in the strange world of Blake's art in its fuller dynamic of both the text, the words, but also all of those illustrations that he included.